Hello, and welcome to Baltic Ways, a podcast bringing you interviews and insights from the world of Baltic studies. I'm your host, Indra Ekmanis. Today I'm thrilled to bring you a discussion on slow memory, a topic explored in a recent special issue of Slovak Ethnology. The issue was co-edited by Violeta Davoliūtė, who joins me in conversation along with resaar, whose research together with Kristi Jõesalu from the University of Tartu looked at slow conflict in a comparative study of Baltic history museums, focusing on the representation of Russophone minorities. Stay tuned.
I am so pleased to be able to speak with you and to dive into this special issue of Slovak Ethnology, this idea of slow memory and slow conflict that you are working on. So I wonder, Violeta, can you tell us a little bit about this project and also your relationship to Europast, which is one of our partners at Baltic Ways?
My name is Violeta Davoliūtė. I am a professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. My research has largely focused on the intersection of historical trauma, memory, politics of memory and identity in the Baltics and East Central Europe. And for the past 3 years, I have had the privilege of leading this large Horizon Europe project called Facing the Past, Public History for a Stronger Europe, or simply Europast. And Vilnius University Institute of International Relations and Political Science, as I said, was leading this project, but we had fantastic partners, Lund University in Sweden, University of Luxembourg, so Center for Contemporary and Digital History, and also a center, Leibniz Center, for Contemporary History in Potsdam, Germany. So this was very much an international partnership, and the project was essentially about bridging the gap between professional historians and the wider public, and also exploring kind of best and worst practices of public history in different regions, in different countries. We really try to establish public history as a critical field in our region. And we try to move beyond simple national narratives in order to understand how history is co-produced in the public sphere, how critical engagement with the past can strengthen democratic resilience today. Now, after this long description of the project, I finally come to the kind of the main theme of our conversation today, that is the special issue of Slovak Ethnology. So the special issue grew out of that spirit of partnership with different scholars who worked for both Europast project, but also this cost action. So this is another large project which was called Slow Memory, Transformative Practices in Times of Uneven and Accelerating Change, which also brought together a large network of scholars led by Professor Jenny Wustenberg from Nottingham Trent University. And it's in this cooperation that the three editors got together, Barbara Tonquist-Pleva, who was our partner from Lund University, and Monika Vzgulova from a Slovak Academy of Sciences. And we decided to invite scholars who are engaged with this concept of slow memory that we will, I'm sure, discuss now. But maybe Anna wants to tell her story, how she ended up in this special issue, and then I can also tell a few more stories about how we got together.
That sounds great, yeah.
My name is resaar, and I'm a professor of oral history and memory studies at the University of Tartu. Well, first, me and Kristi Jõesalu, we have a research project known as Mnemus, or by official title, Practices and Challenges of Mnemonic Pluralism in Baltic History Museums, that we started in 2021. And this project examines how history museums in Baltic states handle the diverse and sometimes also conflicting ways people remember the 20th century. So the main goal is to see whether and how museums can support democratic pluralism. It has very many contact points to Europast in this interest in how museums create spaces where multiple voices and perspectives are recognized and even welcomed rather than silenced. So what Mnemus does, first it explores curatorial practices, looks at how museum curators shape exhibitions to allow room for debate, and it studies what helps or hinders museums in giving space to diverse memories, including museum policies, societal expectations, curatorial mnemonic positionalities, or political pressures. What do? We study how Baltic museums tell and curate the 20th century history, especially tough and contested stories, and whether they can truly include a range of voices and memories, and to learn what works, what doesn't work, and how museums can better support pluralistic society. Where we saw the connection to this special issue was through the concept of slow conflict that relates to slow memory, but takes the next step in our discussion.
Maybe Violeta, you can tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about that concept of slow memory.
That's right. Basically, we develop it a bit more in the introduction, but in our view, slow memory belongs to a category of so-called sensitizing concepts. So this term was coined by the American sociologist Herbert Blumer back in the 1950s. And we found this helpful because unlike definitive concepts, which give you a kind of rigid checklist of what to see, a sensitizing concept is more like a compass. So it gives you a general sense of direction. So memory studies traditionally is focused on fast events, if you will, wars, revolutions, sudden ruptures. And so using this slow memory as a sensitizing tool then encourages researchers to slow down and notice the quiet creeping changes that very often remain unnoticed. So processes like environmental shifts, for example, or long-term social transformations that lack a clear before and after, so to say, but are deeply transformative. So this is really the shift of perspective. And we had a number of excellent articles applying this lens in different ways. We have basically 8 articles in the special issue that covers countries like Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Czechia, Slovakia, and so on, mostly focused on East Central Europe, but not only. And what is particularly relevant for us today, I believe, is the contribution from the Baltic scholars. So we had several Baltic scholars who came up with presented their research. And so Ene and Kirsti contributed really fascinating study of the Baltic museums, as it was mentioned before, in all 3 countries. That is not done so frequently, I have to say. There are several people who are working across the region, but there is not so much. Maybe Anna will talk about this more. But basically, they contributed what they defined as slow conflict in what they observed in these museums as far as the representation of Russophone minorities is concerned. The migrants who basically came to this area as part of the Soviet project after the war and so on. So I found this very pertinent, very interesting. And they looked at how these institutions navigate this kind of long, simmering legacy of Soviet era migration. So I found this a very timely contribution, and it can tell us how they came up with this notion of slow conflict in the Baltic museums.
Who knows, really? I mean, coming up with a concept is a very slow process, actually. And what happens in this process is that you lose track of when the transformation or change occurs. I don't know really how we did it, but I would like to a little bit explain what we see as slow conflict in this context. So in memory studies, slow conflict, also slow transformation of conflict, pretty much refers to the idea that if we take the same vocabulary that Violeta used before, the war and violence, so conflict refers to the idea that peace and war aren't like light switch that can be simply flipped on and off, and this is war and this is peace.
Yeah.
Instead, slow conflict is a long-term process that continues to shape society very long after the official fighting has stopped. Scholars of slow memory look at how the conflict kind of seeps into the decades that follow the actual conflict. The conflict can continue economic shifts in social sciences, in denials, meaning how a society slowly struggles to omit its role in past violence, for example. And this process can take generations. And the slow conflict that we have studied from the memory studies perspective is an interethnic conflict, which is a long-term underlying tension between ethnic groups that develops gradually and persists over decades. And in Baltic contexts, this refers to the uneasy relationship between native populations and the Russophone minorities who arrived during the Soviet era. So what makes it slow? It unfolds over generations. It's embedded in everyday life, in everyday institutions, in culture and memory. It is very much rooted in historical trauma, which went resolved after independence. Instead, the trauma shaped identities or keep shaping identities as social boundaries. It is related to identity defense practices and segregation. So meaning that both sides, the native population and the migrants, developed defensive identity practices. Natives feared losing their language and culture, while Russophones clung to their own identity. And this led to parallel worlds with limited interaction. The slow conflict, why it is persistent and slow and keep on going in decades and decades, is because it's vulnerable to different changing contexts. And in Baltic region, it's very much related to ontological insecurity in the face of Russian aggression. So it's not always visible, but it is impactful. Even without violence, slow conflicts affect social cohesion and trust and integration. And as I said, they can flare up during political crisis or in response to external pressures. So this is a conflict that we deal with in asking how museums deal with this conflict, whether they admit its conflict, whether they see the participants in the conflict, so the two sides more or less, as enemies per se or as equal sides with autonomous perspectives, which can be juxtaposed and used as a means of critical dialogue, for example. So this is what we try to analyze in Baltic Museum exhibitions. And in response to Violeta, it's true that research that involves all three Baltic states and concentrates on museums is rather rare. I think only occupation museums have so far earned this attention from the academic side. So we are happy that we got access more or less to all museums that we wanted to access. And the practitioners were really very helpful in explaining their approaches and giving us tours. Yeah.
And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the process of your research. We're talking about slow memory and slow conflict, and I think that The work or the research also took almost a decade of your observations from 2016 to 2024.
Yes, well,
So-
yes, it's true. The research itself has been much longer, has taken much longer than the actual project that we talk about. This is because, and also why I think the comparative studies are so few. It is because museums change exhibitions. So to have comparative exhibition opened at the same time, it's not a regular thing. So therefore, to gather material, you need to proceed very slowly, which is a dangerous thing to do in neoliberal academia, really. But we had this very fortunate opportunity to do so. Yeah.
Violeta, I think that you also talk about the pressure of the academic environment against this concept of slow memory. Can you tell us a little bit from your perspective as well?
I can only support what Enes said. There is this pressure to deliver fast and to apply and to always find kind of cutting edge topics and so on. And that really sometimes just prevents reflection and just the possibility to just focus and observe seemingly smaller details or kind of insignificant aspects, which in fact are significant. So yeah, academia itself in some ways need to slow down, I would think.
No, but I think that it is such an important point to make, especially in the context that we are in, where it's all about production, and where a lot of the work that we do is exactly as you both mentioned, in those very small details that are easily overlooked without requisite time and space to consider their impact.
And I very much liked what Anne and Kirsti said about this simmering conflict or even inherited conflict. You did not use this term, but I keep thinking about it when it's not visible, it's not present, and yet it is. I mean, it's there. It's in the slow conflict that is something that is accumulating and then can erupt. So I found this very productive.
You know that we're talking about this long simmering ideas of conflict and memory, but the research that you did is happening also in the context of not just the banal or daily experiences that are shaping our perceptions, but actual true conflict, not so far away from the Baltic countries and Ukraine's, of course. I wonder, how does that external event impact the way that you looked at these museums and the kind of conclusions that you're drawing?
Most of the exhibitions that we analyzed were opened before 2022.
Yeah.
And they were not changed. At some point, we started to specifically ask that exhibitions were changed as well. I recently visited the exhibition on occupation of Georgia in Tbilisi, and after the full-scale invasion, their exhibition was changed a little bit. Something was removed, and I couldn't really establish what exactly, but there were holes in the exhibition. So in Baltic history museums, this did not occur. But maybe in relation to war in Ukraine and how it impacted Baltic societies and also directly impacted museum work, I would like to tell a story of our project work. So we had this very ambitious idea at the beginning of our project in 2021, that we make our own exhibition. We try out this agonistic museology so that you juxtapose different, even contradictory and conflicting ideas or subject positions and try to really force or generate critical debate about historical experiences and what memory does with these experiences. And so we did. Together with Estonian National Museum, we started to prepare an exhibition that would bring in Russian-speaking voices from northeast Estonia. This is an area where the most of the migration happened, and place them as openly juxtaposed to the dominant Estonian narrative as possible. And the idea was inspired by agonistic museology.
Before you go on, can you explain
Yeah.
agonistic museology?
It's our working term, actually. It comes from the notion of agonistic democracy, meaning that the conflict is not something that should be avoided, but it's a normal thing in a democratic environment, dealing with conflict with respect. So then the agonistic museology, as we understand it, is a concept that encourages museums or a way of doing museology to show conflicting perspectives and invites this critical dialogue and avoid one-sided stories. And one-sided stories, authoritative stories, is what museums usually do. And we wanted to do it a little bit otherwise. And we also wanted to make space for stories that are usually marginalized, as our article also shows. So we had this very neat plan to use audiovisual storytelling and focus on themes like migration and work in oil shale mines, and language and citizenship and environmental crisis that this activity actually brought forth, and create a small universe inside of big exhibition, a space for difference. And then the war in Ukraine started in 22, and everything pretty much changed.
Yeah.
So the political climate shifted dramatically. Estonia entered, so to say, a new period of desovietization. The Soviet monuments were removed. The Russophones were increasingly seen as a security risk. So suddenly our project was operating in a very tense atmosphere where Soviet history was a topic of controversy. And when we compiled our team, then we invited a Estonian-Russian film director, Alyona Surshikova, as a lead curator. And she has worked for years to build bridges between Estonians and Russians and functioned pretty much as advocate for Estonian-Russian community. And after the invasion, she transformed radically. She has Ukrainian roots, and she developed suspicion towards the community she worked with before, the Russian community she worked with before. And she wanted to include themes about the Ukraine war and new refugees. And she also found it difficult to work with the community, express distrust towards the Russophones and so forth. So another curator, Terje Anepoja, who is a museum anthropologist who has done years of fieldwork amongst miners community. She was really pushing back. She wanted to defend the community and avoid any harm as a true anthropologist, any harm come to it. So we had this really emotional situation, managing our own emotions and the effects the war created was very hard. Also, the content we worked with became very, very sensitive. Topics like World War II, Soviet nostalgia, even minor celebrations suddenly felt risky. At one point, we became masters of self-censorship, really. We feared, for example, that showing decorated miners or war commemoration would be misread, and we cut out some clips entirely or softened the storytelling to avoid controversy. So what happened? when the crisis suddenly became very intensive and the ontological insecurity was overflowing in society, the agonism, what we wanted to have as agonism, it turned it into caution. So instead of bold, conflicting perspectives, we ended up with short, polished clips that hinted at tension, but avoided direct confrontation. And what we concluded from that was that agonistic museology works best when conflict is clear and manageable. So when there is not slow conflict, and especially slow conflict made vulnerable by new crises. So we already had complex conflict as a background, a slow tension between Estonians and Russophones. Then the war in Ukraine made it even more explosive. And in that environment, the line between constructive dialogue and harmful antagonism became really razor thin. And we had to compromise. And the way we compromised made us more aware of the choices that the museum curators do when they represent such sensitive topics as migration or migration in the context of slow conflict. And when we first approached it with much academic criticism, why is a curator, when juxtaposing different ethnic historical subject positions, why they use reconciliation and smoothing over the conflict rather than posing it as a real conflict as it was. Then now we had this practical experience ourselves to see how to live through the renewed conflict. Yeah. It was very educational.
Yeah, the real life experience of
and
dealing
it also
with that.
exemplifies how the real life beyond our borders, museum borders, society borders, or regional borders actually influence the tiny curatorial work.
Well, if I may add an example from Lithuania, so I think there were some changes to some of the exhibitions. So in your article, you also mentioned this temporary exhibition Trapped with Central Heating.
Yes.
I think it was in the National Museum of Lithuania. And this exhibition was open in 2023, but the curators started working on it earlier. And then 2022 happened. And I talked to some of the curators and they say they did somehow change the exhibition. So, 2022 was a big event. And we had in our workshop people from the museums coming and asking us, how are we supposed to represent the Soviet past, for example, even toy museum, like Soviet toys, so that it is not nostalgic or so on. In any case, all kinds of questions were bothering the curators from different museums, precisely regarding the Soviet experience in this case. But what I really wanted to add is that the current context is undeniably challenging. We all know it. And as you and Kristi note in your article, that this what you call defensive democracy in the Baltics has indeed intensified since 2022. And when the society feels this immediate existential threat, the natural reaction is to rely on fast memory. Clear distinctions between friend and enemy, victim and perpetrator, good and bad, and so on. However, it seems that the war risks accelerating the erasure of the complexities and nuances, that these different voices. But if we only focus on this fast geopolitical conflict, we really risk losing the sight of the slow internal social shifts that are essential for long-term democratic health, I believe. So the trajectory for scholars in the Baltic Sea region, I believe, it still lies in using this slow lens, so not abandoning the slow lens to document the resilience of everyday pluralism. I think we need to understand how societies can maintain their democratic values and internal diversity, even while mobilizing against external aggression.
Yeah, it's true. And I also see how not only museum professionals, but also academics, they are conflicted between what is their professional values and ideals. And pluralism is one of them. The democratic museum, absolutely. And then the personal anxieties and geopolitical conditions and all this what is going on in society, it conditions inner conflict in everybody, in academia and in museums. We mapped mnemonic positionalities of museum professionals. We did it in late 2022. And it was very clear how, especially in Latvia and Lithuania, the securing the past positions, they have become very strong. It is still a mystery to us why Estonian museum professionals are more inclined to pluralism than to the securing the past position. The different regional country-specific differences when Estonia stands so much apart from Lithuania and Latvia is striking. We're still working on it, but this survey we made, it really exemplified the same thing we have observed in our own daily lives, that we want to follow our professional values, but then pretty much everything in us screams against it in the face of war. This is also something we should follow as professional researchers, step by step,
Slowly
in the
right?
future. Yeah.
Yeah,
But it's hard, as we said.
it's hard, but it's a direct juxtaposition in this moment of slow conflict and fast moving conflict and hot conflict. You're bringing to a head the reason that it is so critical to take a slow approach in many ways, because these quick divisions that happen in a securitized context don't allow for nuance and don't allow for the resolution of conflict, which I think is something that as societies we all should, or theoretically should strive for. So I really appreciate your openness about sharing your own sort of perspectives on that, both from an academic perspective and personal as well. We're coming to the end of our time, but I wonder, maybe you both can kind of give us some of your insights into the trajectory of the slow memory and slow conflict in the Baltic research space.
Yeah. I think what this volume indicates is the need to focus on detail and focus on entrenched yet invisible relationships. When we ask why the change is so slow to occur, because for scholars who are interested in more fast memory, for them the slowness is something that irritates and makes it overly critical. And in this relationship between communicative and cultural, if you look at them really closely with your slow analytical lens, then you see how the power relations change and change back, meaning that communicative memory can actually hinder aspects taking root in cultural memory and vice versa. And it's very much related to access to museum space, for example, the role of source communities, which groups are being defined by institutions as source communities, which also defines very much who is going to give a voice and not. And so what this volume would give to future research is, to my mind, exactly this detailed methodologies to see and to notice these tensions, which is a little bit beyond the Baltic Sea region studies.
True.
Luckily.
But still, I would add to that, it's from a different angle. I'm very happy that there are more and more people who have the possibility to explain the nuances. Very often you have researchers who portray the entire region in kind of sweeping strokes without details, without nuances, without differences. It's also fast, quick work. And one has this kind of scholarship from big publishing houses and so on. So I'm so happy that we can see not only this collaboration, international cooperation among different scholars in the region and beyond the region, but also a possibility to present the nuances, the contrast, the very interesting and intense work on the ground, if you will, also debates and conflicts among curators and scholars and different methodologies, and how rich actually it is on the ground. So for me, this is another angle that I think is very important. I think it's a big value, and I hope that we will continue working towards this direction. We want to be heard. We want to be known. We are very interesting. In terms of, no, it is true. It's true, because sometimes you think, okay, all of these museums or whatever in the area, they're all more or less the same, or it's not. No, it's not the case.
That's not true.
It's not true, and they're relevant and methodologically relevant. So I think this issue actually demonstrates that as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been a rather quick conversation for something that we could talk about for quite a long time, but I appreciate your time and for sharing your insights with us. And yes, everyone should go and read this special issue. We will have the link in our show notes, and I look forward to opportunities perhaps to speak with you all again. And thank you so much for your time and for sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for tuning in to Baltic Ways, a podcast from the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, produced in partnership with the Baltic Initiative at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. A note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of AABS or FPRI. I'm your host, Indra Ekmanis. Subscribe to our newsletters at aabs-balticstudies.org and fpri.org/Baltic-initiative, or find us on Substack for more from the world of Baltic studies. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.